Welcome. My name is Devin Naar, and I am an associate professor of history and Jewish studies and chair of the Sephardic Studies Program at the University of Washington. I'm grateful to the Hamilton Institute for inviting me to give my presentation today, Claiming Columbus, Sephardic Jews and Other Others in the American Racial Imagination. Now, you might recall around this time last year, there were news reports circulating in the United States and across the world about an allegedly major discovery about Christopher Columbus, according to a documentary coming out of Spain that investigated some DNA evidence. Columbus was not of Italian heritage, as we generally imagine, but rather he was of Sephardic Jewish heritage, of Spanish Jewish ancestry. So the documentary in Spain purported. And this was sort of like a big deal at the time. But the reality is, it's not that big of a deal precisely because, well, many people of Spanish speaking heritage, whether in Spain or in Latin America, perhaps as many as 20%, have Jewish heritage, according to DNA tests, the result of the intermixing that came with waves of conversos, of people of Jewish ancestry who were forcibly baptized into Catholicism, and they entered the broader community in the Spanish society. Now, regardless of whether Columbus may have had Sephardic Jewish heritage, he clearly did not think of himself as Jewish in any meaningful way. He wrote favorably to the king and queen of Spain about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, and as a matter of fact, the resources confiscated from Spain's Jews were actually used in part to fund Columbus's voyages. So what's interesting for me and what I'd like to share with you today is not so much was Columbus of this ancestry or that ancestry, but rather I'm interested in why different groups have claimed Columbus as their own. What kind of political and social work does the claim that Columbus is part of this community and not that community do? What I'd like to suggest is that groups that have claimed Columbus as their own, including Italians and, well, Sephardic Jews, I'm going to see that, and other groups, I found evidence of Greeks and Armenians also making the same claim. These are groups, communities that have roots in the Mediterranean and that have experienced a certain degree of marginalization in American society, who have not always been recognized as fully white. And by claiming Columbus as their own, they are trying to stake a claim at the foundation of the United States, at the foundation of the story of white European settlement in the United States, to argue that rather than be on the margins, group X or Y is actually at the center of the story, to argue to the more dominant American white Protestant communities that you may think we are on the margins, but actually, if it weren't for us, the Italians make this argument, the Sephardic Jews will make this argument, Greeks will make this argument. If it weren't for us, you would not be here in the first place. So they kind of try to flip the script, so to speak. And what I'd like to do is show you how that played out in the specific case of the Sephardic Jews. But before doing that, I want to set up a little bit to show you how the same dynamics played out in the Italian case. You know, there was no Columbus Day until approximately 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And this was instituted by President Benjamin Harrison as a one-time holiday. Why? The event was meant to celebrate Italian-American contributions to society in a moment in which an apology essentially was necessary to be made, because one of the largest mass lynchings in American history had transpired the year before, and that's what you're looking at here on the left, which was the lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in New Orleans. The scenario was as such. A group of Italians had been accused with little evidence of killing the police chief of New Orleans. It was unclear who had done it, but the xenophobia at the time, the nativism at the time, pegged it on the local Italian community, most of whom were of Sicily. And in this time, by the way, it wasn't exactly clear just how white or not white Italians were. Some of them were darker complected, and there even came before the courts of Louisiana a case over whether an Italian person marrying a black person violated Jim Crow anti-miscegenation laws, which said that white people and black people couldn't marry each other. Well, the court was ambivalent about that because they couldn't determine whether Italians were white or not. So a white person marrying a black person clearly would be in violation of the anti-miscegenation laws, but an Italian marrying a black person, it wasn't clear. So this gives you a sense of some of the environment there. So that's the context in which the lynching of these Italian folks took place. And so the instantiation of Columbus Day was both an apology and a celebration of Italian contributions to the American society, namely through the introduction of European presence in the American continents. Okay. And that resulted in the establishment of Columbus's statue at, well, the eponymously named Columbus Circle in 1892. And it was funded on the one hand by Italian businessmen and by the New York Italian newspaper as a way to demonstrate we are here, we are part of this society, we're not on the outside, we shouldn't be treated essentially like black people and be lynched, we should be treated like white people, we are part and essential to the functioning and the foundations of European settler society of the United States here in North America. And it wasn't until 1934, by the way, that FDR rendered Columbus Day a federal holiday, which was also a little bit ironic because it was in the same moment in which immigration restriction was also in effect that targeted principally immigrants coming from non-Anglo-Saxon Protestant countries. So it excluded everybody from Asia. This is the 1924 Immigration Restriction Act. And it imposed very strict quotas on people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. The primary targets of immigration restriction in 1924 were Italians and Eastern European Jews. So you can see some of the tensions that are at play in this moment. How does the Sephardic Jewish story enter into the mix? Now, I want to give you a little bit of background just to make sure we're all on the same page, because Sephardic Jews are perhaps a little bit more of an obscure population with many different multifaceted dimensions to their experience. We're looking here at a map of Europe and the Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. There was a very prominent Jewish community established in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain and Portugal, in the medieval times. And as already alluded to, in 1492, in the times of the Inquisition, the King and Queen of Spain expelled all of the Jews from the kingdom, and many of those Jews traveled across the Mediterranean, and the largest proportion of them settled in the vast reaches of the Muslim world of the Ottoman Empire. That's the region here in the yellow, along the Mediterranean Sea, from the Balkans to Turkey to parts of the Middle East and North Africa. That is the place where the vast majority of the Jews who were expelled from Spain in 1492 found refuge. They found refuge from the sword of Catholicism, under the protective wings, in the language that they used, of the Sultan, the Caliph of the Ottoman Empire. We cannot get into all the details of the story of Jews in the Ottoman Empire, but I would like to emphasize for the purposes of this presentation that by the time we arrive to the 19th century, by the time we arrive to 1892, we see that Jews living in the Ottoman Empire, even though they continued to speak their Spanish-based language, which they wrote in Hebrew letters, it was called Ladino. You can see it here in this newspaper here. This is El Tiempo in Hebrew letters, the Times of Istanbul. Even though they preserved their own language that was based in Spanish and Hebrew letters that incorporated a variety of the linguistic influences of the neighbors, including not only Hebrew, but Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Italian, and French. They could speak their own language. They could practice their own religion, organize their own institutions, but they did not have equal status as Muslims in that society. There were no equal rights for anybody in this society. In fact, there were no equal rights for anybody anywhere in the world until the revolutions of the end of the 18th century. And citizenship laws would be introduced into the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century as well, removing many of the things that put them in a second-class status. By this time, they were already formally recognized as citizens of the Ottoman Empire, and you can see the way in which they are embedding themselves in the Ottoman context. So here you can see a Jewish wedding contract, a ketubah, that includes the signs of Islam, the star and the crescent at the top of the Jewish wedding contract. Now, the star and crescent were both a sign of Islam and also the symbol that was emblazoned on the Ottoman flag. So they did this not because they were Muslims, but because these Islamic symbols were symbols of the Ottoman state, and Jews wanted to demonstrate that they were part of the dominant society, that they were part of Ottoman society. And you can find Jews and other non-dominant populations trying to demonstrate that they belong in whatever societies they may reside. The newspaper here is another very fascinating example, because this is a newspaper that commemorates not the 400th anniversary of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, that is lamented, but rather it is a celebration of the arrival of the Jews from Spain to the Ottoman Empire in 1492. And there were celebrations organized all across the Ottoman Empire in which Jews in their synagogues and on the streets praised the Ottoman Sultan, praised the Ottoman state for having welcomed their ancestors and provided them safe haven and refuge from the clutches of the Inquisition. So they see themselves very much as part of the Ottoman enterprise at that time, and that also shapes how the first Jews from the Ottoman Empire presented themselves and were perceived upon their arrival in the United States right at that very moment. The first Jews from the Ottoman Empire in sort of like a community arrive in 1893 to Chicago for the Chicago's World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, in which countries from all over the world represented themselves on the American stage. What was their culture about? What was their history? What did they have to offer to the world? And about 4/5, can you imagine this? 4/5 of the representatives of the Ottoman Empire, which was the largest Islamic empire in the world at the time, 4/5 of the entourage of the Ottoman Empire were Sephardic Jews. And here you can see the guy on the far end wearing a kind of a turban and the Ottoman style clothes. He was Faraway Moses, and he introduced and popularized Oriental carpets in American society, and he was known apparently as Mark Twain's tour guide in Istanbul. In the middle, you have Rosa, the Turkish dancer. She was a Turkish dancer, but she was also a Sephardic Jewish woman. And then you have the interior of a mosque. At the Ottoman pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair, this group of mostly Jews erected what would become the first mosque built in the United States. They built it just in time to recite their Yom Kippur prayers inside. So a really remarkable, fascinating dynamic that takes place in which Jews, the Islamic world, and the Ottoman Empire are connected in very tight ways. This, we will see, will become a tremendous liability. This is especially the case in which, in the United States, most Jews who came to this country were not of Sephardic Jewish heritage. They did not come from the Ottoman Empire, but rather they came from Eastern and Central Europe. They did not speak Ladino or a Spanish-based language. They spoke Yiddish. And the Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire were a relatively small population. Here you could see 20,000 by 1914. If you take this to the start of immigration restriction in 1924, we get to about 40 or 50,000. But still, compared to the 2 million or more Yiddish-speaking Jews, they were a tiny, tiny minority. But they were still visible in places like the Lower East Side and Harlem, precisely because of their difference on the one hand, and they didn't fit people's expectations in terms of racial, ethnic, national, linguistic categories. And here we can see during World War I an essay about what were then called the Levantine Jews, or also Oriental Jews, emphasizing their status in the East, calling into question, who exactly are these strange people that do not fit our expectations? Who are these strangers who can be seen in the ghetto of the Lower East Side, sitting outside of coffee houses, smoking strange-looking water pipes, sipping a dark liquid from tiny cups, and playing a game of checkers or dice, a game that we are not familiar with? So they're referring to the dark liquid from tiny cups, that's coffee, and the game is sheshbesh, or backgammon. See the signs on these institutions. They read Cafe Constantinople, Cafe Oriental, Cafe Smyrna, and there are other signs in Hebrew characters that you perhaps cannot read. Are they Jews? No, it cannot be. They do not look like Jews. They do not speak Yiddish. Listen, what is that strange tongue they are using? It sounds like Spanish or Mexican. Are they Spaniards or Mexicans? If so, where did they get the coffee houses? An importation from Greece and Turkey. So you can see the conundrum that Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire posed to the American public and to the American legal system, as we'll see in a moment. They were Jewish, but they spoke Spanish, but they came from the Muslim world. In the American imaginary, are they going to be considered European or Asiatic or Oriental? Will they be considered white or will they be considered brown? The answers to those questions were not idle, not just had social implications or economic implications. These were legally defined categories, precisely because since essentially the founding of this country in 1790, the first Congress of the United States passed the first Naturalization Act of 1790, which decreed that somebody born in a country other than the United States who wanted to become a citizen of the United States had to essentially meet only one criterion in order to be eligible for naturalization, to become a citizen of the United States. That is, that person had to be a free white person. Now you may say, free white, well, isn't that redundant? No, because there were some people that were indentured servants and others. So if you're a free white person, the whiteness element is the key element. If you were not white, you could not become a citizen of the United States if you were born elsewhere. This changed after the Civil War, where the laws were amended such that people of African ancestry or Black people could also become citizens of the United States. But it left open a very interesting question. What if you are not clearly white? And what if you are not clearly Black? Will you be eligible to become a citizen of the United States if you were born elsewhere? The answer to this was decided in many, many, many court cases across the country as many different kinds of people who were not necessarily clearly white or not necessarily clearly Black went to the courts to try to demonstrate that they were white and eligible for naturalization. And here I give you a list of some of the main cases that emerged. All different kinds of people claiming that they were white based on all different kinds of reasons. We cannot get into all of these right now, but what I do want to emphasize for you is that about 11 of the 51 major cases dealt with people coming from the Ottoman Empire, namely Syrians and Armenians, who were part of the borderline status. And eventually, Syrians and Armenians and Arabians would be designated white by law. When Christian Syrian goes before the court, says that he wants to become a citizen of the United States, he claims that he's white. The judge says, "Why are you white?" And the petitioner says, "Because I'm Christian." The judge says, "But you're bronze." And the plaintiff says, "But I come from the same part of the world as Jesus Christ himself. Would you not let Jesus Christ become a citizen of the United States?" So you can see that what was the meaning of race at the time was not predicated exclusively on skin color, although that was a piece of it. There were also ideas about civilizational status, about culture, about language, about behavior, and all of these other kinds of more, maybe, shall we say, performative aspects or cultural aspects of identity that were used to adjudicate whether somebody is white or not. Ultimately, the courts would decide that Syrians and Armenians do count as white, and that is why, until today, Middle Easterners are technically considered, no matter the color of their skin, are technically considered white by law. Now, that may change, and there have been some efforts to renegotiate that, but as it stands, Middle Easterners are technically white by law. The United States government actually established a formal hierarchy of the different peoples of the world, from the most desirable to the least desirable, from the most white to the least white. And this was commissioned by the Dillingham Commission, which created a dictionary of races in 1911. This was done under the auspices of Teddy Roosevelt, who was progressive. It's a progressive administration, but you can see the workings of race pseudoscience at the time, and the desire to ensure that Western European white Protestant peoples would be considered at the top of the hierarchy. And you see it moving down from there. Down, the print is very small, but at the top you can see here, hopefully, you can see Scandinavian, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, German, Dutch, English. No surprise there that they would be at the top. At the bottom would be American Indian and Negro. What's very interesting for our purposes here is if you look at the very bottom of the Caucasian category, outside of the Aryan category, are Arabian, Hebrew, and Syrian. They're at the very bottom in this different category called Semitic. Turkish is even lower. Turkish is in the Mongolian category. So thinking about Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire, many of them will be designated as Turkish by race, and this will pose a problem. If they're outside of the Caucasian framework, if they're outside of the white framework, will they be eligible for naturalization? And then you see here Spanish. Spanish is clearly in the Caucasian category. It's not in the top, but it is inside the Caucasian category in the italic framework: Spanish, Spanish American, Mexican, Portuguese. So this would have a dramatic impact on what different possibilities of negotiating their newfound status in the United States Jews from the Ottoman Empire would be able to enact. This became clear. Look, the New York Times, is the Turk a white man? This is debated, right? The American courts have barred from citizenship Chinese, Japanese, Burmese, and their half-breeds. Will they bar Turks? The original Turks were of the yellow or Mongolian race, but in their westward progress, the Turks freely intermingled with the Caucasian races whom they subjugated. The Turks today are descendants of Arabs, Kurds, Slavs, Albanian Greeks. But the Turkish mind, notice, it's not their skin, it's not their appearance. It is about perceptions of how they think and how they act, what their civilization is. It does not work as ours. They are a cruel and a massacring people, and they have lost none of their ancient proclivities. But they are also Europeans, as much white people as the Huns, Finns, and Cossacks. So the New York Times remained ambivalent. Ultimately, Turks would also be considered white by law. Now, as these debates about who is eligible for citizenship and who is not, who is white and who is not, who gets the protections and privileges of citizenship and who does not, the Jewish community more generally, mostly Eastern and Central European Jews who have their own internal hierarchies, with the Portuguese Jews at the top, the German Jewish elite then coming next, and the masses of the Eastern European Jews coming in like sort of the third tier. Now we have this other tier that enters, the Levantine or Oriental Jews. And what you see transpire is that Eastern European Jews will use the Ottoman Jews, the Oriental Jews, as a foil through which to designate themselves European, in contrast to these Oriental Jews who may be outside the bounds of European society, outside the bounds of whiteness, outside the bounds of civilization, outside the bounds of those really eligible and deserving of American citizenship. So you can see in the 1920s still a report commissioned by the Jewish Federation of New York, which was the largest Jewish philanthropic organization at the time, which begins by essentially claiming that Sephardic Jews are almost as alien to their Ashkenazi kinsmen as are the Negroes to the average white Southerner. Again, this was not an idle statement. This is a universe in which blacks and whites in the South, they cannot marry each other, right? This is a Jim Crow environment. And you can see the coverage of this report by the Federation playing out in the Jewish Daily Forward, which, by the way, was essentially a socialist, a liberal newspaper at the time, does not reserve much respect for the newcomers from the Ottoman Empire. In the old country, the Turkish Jews had no cultural life of their own worth speaking of. They had no common body of customs and traditions, no common literature, no knowledge of or curiosity about their past. They had not been revived by a great spiritual movement such as Hasidism, which rescued the Jews of Eastern Europe from stagnancy. They had been a backward people in a backward country. And how could they hope to progress in this country? That was pretty damning. And as you imagine, Sephardic Jewish leaders in New York were enraged by the depictions, the negative depictions of themselves that regularly appeared in Jewish and general American newspapers. And they discussed it in their own private correspondence, in their own Ladino language newspapers. The question is, how are we going to improve our image? How are we going to improve our status? How are we going to demonstrate to the Jewish community and to the American public that we have something to offer, that we are not backwards in the way that it is claimed of us? They have to appeal to outside authority in order to do this. And one of the ways that they do this is by appealing to an emerging Spanish discourse that was circulating not only in Spain, but also in the Americas at this time. And this was the concept of philo-Sefaradismo. You may have heard of philo-Semitism, which is loving of Jews, like a pro-Jewish sort of attitude, a pro-Jewish attitude that oftentimes is based on stereotypes and has an anti-Semitic undercurrent to it. Philo-Semitism works similarly for Sephardic Jews. It is a ostensibly pro-Sephardic initiative, but in very specific terms. How does the Spanish movement emerge? It emerges in the wake of Spain, we're back to Spain again, Spain's own loss of its overseas empire in the Americas with the Spanish-American War of 1898, the loss of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, etc. Spain ceased to be a major world power. How was world power defined at the time? Do you have colonies? Have you subjugated natives overseas? This would be a way to assert one's power. Okay? Spain lost it. So the generation of 98, as would come to be called, goes through a kind of crisis, trying to reimagine who is Spain, what is Spain, what is the meaning of Spanishness. And one of the politicians at the time, Angel Pulido, and here's a photograph of him, happened to be traveling on the Danube in the Balkans just around this time, and he encountered other passengers on the ship who were speaking a language that sounded to him like Spanish, but was a little bit different, and it turned out these were Sephardic Jews speaking Ladino, and he had an insight and a discovery. Wow, there are people that have been excised from the Spanish homeland for hundreds of years, yet they have preserved far away the Spanish language. It must be a sign that they still have affection and love for Spain. Was actually the fact that the Ottoman Empire did not impose any kind of assimilationist project, and Jews could speak their language, Armenians could speak their language, Greeks could speak their language, but the idea that Sephardic Jews must have clung to Spanish because they loved Spain would plant the seed for this philo-Sephardic movement and give the idea to a variety of Spanish government, merchant, and cultural leaders in Spain that maybe the Sephardic Jews in the Mediterranean could be their new kind of colony, their new interest in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. And Pulido wrote a very important book that came out a few years after the loss of Spain's colonies to the Americas. And this book was called Españoles sin Patria, y la Raza Sephardi, Spaniards Without a Homeland. And he wanted to go to the Sephardic Jews across the world and say, you guys belong to us and we belong to you. You come back to Spain insofar as you can help rebuild Spanish economy and culture in the places that you live. He didn't want them actually to go back to Spain. He didn't want to undo the expulsion of 1492, but he wanted them to be agents of Spanish empire, agents of Spanish culture and commerce wherever they lived. And some Sephardic Jews in the United States took hold. They seized this new discourse because it was a way to elevate and validate their own position. And here you can see during World War I, campaign emerging in American Ladino newspapers to make the argument, contrary to what our detractors say, we are not Oriental, we are not Ottoman, we are actually Spanish. And this argument is so fascinating because it completely repudiated the argument that the first Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire had been making when they arrived at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. They came saying, we're part of the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, we are Oriental. We're selling Oriental carpets. They introduced Oriental tobacco, Turkish tobacco, to the American public for the first time. They were there as Ottomans. Now the circumstances have changed, and especially with the Ottoman entry into World War I, joining the Axis powers, Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire ran the risk of being classified as enemy aliens. So they did quite a bit of intellectual and public messaging work to try to shift how they were perceived in American society. Here's one of the editorials by Benzion Bahar, who was from Ottoman Palestine. He had come to New York at this time, and he argues the Spanish language and the land of Spain are not Oriental, and similarly, the official language in Turkey is not Spanish. And we who arrived here in the United States, immigrants from Turkey, were there in Turkey, meaning the Ottoman Empire, merely as guests for 400 years. So rather than take the argument, we were saved by the Sultan, we became citizens, we owe a debt of gratitude. No, let's repudiate all that and let's reclaim our earlier Spanish roots. This will be more beneficial in the American context. Now he writes this in Ladino, in this old style Spanish and Hebrew letters, but of course that language itself had absorbed aspects of the surrounding culture. So he actually uses the Turkish word for guests, musafires. So even though he's saying, look, we were there, we weren't touched, we weren't adulterated by the Ottoman and the Turkish environment, the reality was, even reflected in his language, that those cultural contexts were strong and they had been made. The effort now was to try to undo that, to say we are Sephardim, we are from Spain, we are not Orientals, we are European, we are not Asiatic, we are white, we are not brown. Now what's interesting is that this campaign did not win over everybody. We have a few different moves that take place. Some, like Joseph Gedalicia, who is the president of the Federation of Oriental Jews, that title being preserved, defended the category of the Orient. He says, I believe Oriental is the appropriate term. He says, I don't want to be called Sephardic. I feel proud to be classed with Hindus and Chinese and Japanese and other Asiatics. Beside the name reminds us of dear Turkey, to whom we owe so much gratitude and love for protecting us when the civilized countries, European countries, were oppressing us. The word Levantine may be more accurate, but Oriental expresses the Turkish Jew, and we are nothing but Turkish Jews. Although we have passed under the dominion of other countries, we still have the old characteristics. The Oriental Jew never drinks. They manufactured raki, okay. First as a Jew and then as a Turk, he is forbidden. His ethical standard is both Eastern and Jewish, and this means something. In morals, the people of the East are inferior to none. So this guy is proud to stand with the Orient, with the East. Others had more anxieties. Others thought that the embrace of Spain went too far. Here is Moise Gadol, who is the editor of one of the Ladino Zionist newspapers in New York, says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Yes, we may be from Spain, but don't get confused. Don't think that Spain is our actual country. No, 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 no. And here he writes, we cannot undertake such a campaign for the return of the Spanish Jews to their native country because the discussion came, well, if we're really from Spain, maybe we should go back there. Knowing the sad history of the Inquisition and that we would not be so ignorant as to return to a country that left us with such sad memories, he's referring to the Inquisition and the expulsion, we labor for the honor and dignity of our nation, here he refers to the Jewish nation, under the new Jewish national ideal, Zionism, to make our people return to our ancient fatherland, Palestine, and never to another country in any part of the world, since our conviction is that only in this way will the Jewish question be resolved. So you can see he's willing to say, yes, we are from Spain, and he was one of the main promoters of the shift from Oriental to Spanish or Sephardic, but he was using that not to say that Sephardic Jews belong to Spain or should go back to Spain, but rather they should perceive themselves and be perceived as part of the totality of the Jewish people, the Sephardic half compared to the Ashkenazic half. Now, what else transpired is yet others took a different angle and said, you know what? We are connected to Spanish-speaking peoples, but we see ourselves less connected to Puerto Rico and more connected to another place, to Puerto Ricans and to Latin American peoples. And this played out in an effort among Sephardic Jews to join fellow Spanish speakers, especially Puerto Ricans, in radical political movements in New York in the 1920s and 1930s. The Sephardic Jews established the Spanish Jewish branch of the Workers' Communist Party in the 1920s. They were key players in the establishment of the Spanish-speaking Workers' Club in Harlem, also in the 1920s, that brought together these disparate left-leaning workers. And it was a Sephardic Jew from the Ottoman Empire that was appointed by Moscow to establish the Spanish Bureau of the Communist Party. Sephardic Jews were also involved in the Anti-Imperialist League, which was established notably in 1898, which advocated not only for the end of Spanish domination of Puerto Rico and the Philippines, but also the end of American domination of these territories. And some Sephardic Jews would get involved in advocating, especially for Puerto Rican independence. You can see here the cover page of the Cancionario Socialista, which was a Ladino socialist songbook published at the end of World War I by the Sephardic section of the Socialist Party of America. So what I'm trying to get at is that when you take a look at the Sephardic Jewish experience in the United States, many different paths were pursued upon the encounter with American racial castes, racial hierarchies, and with the way in which the established Jewish community internalized some of those very hierarchies, excluding Sephardic Jews, demeaning Sephardic Jews. So taking the title Sephardic was one strategy that went in different ways. Some said we're Sephardic because we're one half of the Jewish people, the other half is Ashkenazi. Some said, okay, we're Sephardic, that means we're Spanish, that means we should go back to Spain. Some said we're Spanish, that means we're part of the Spanish-speaking world that included also the Latino people of the Americas and especially the Puerto Ricans. So many different paths that were at play here. But one of the key paths is the path that would try to attach the Ottoman Jews to their Spanish roots, because it did something else. It not only attached them to Europe, it attached them to the grandeur of medieval Sepharad, to the intellectual tradition of Maimonides, in particular the Rambam, who was a great medieval Spanish philosopher, and the argument would emerge, we are the heirs of the Rambam, we are not backwards, we are not uncivilized, we are the true Spanish Jews, as this guy, Leon Sadi, who was a member of the largest Sephardic organization that emerged at the time, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, and it still exists today in New York. It's still the largest Sephardic membership organization in the United States. And just as the Depression begins, he argues, we are Jews like the others. And if we are still called the people of the book, we will prove it. We are not the gypsies of our people. We have a glorious past, and we still possess the intellectual Jew capable of drawing upon all that our ancestors have bequeathed to us. We will show to our brothers, the Ashkenazim, the European Jews, that the descendants of Maimonides, Ibn Gabirol, and Abravanel, these are also other famous thinkers and leaders of medieval Spain, still count among them individuals who can become leaders of their people. And if we still have our dignity, we will show that we are the true Spanish Jews who made Spain rich in money and the Jew rich in knowledge. Now it's interesting, you'll notice that none of the discourse until now invokes Columbus. Okay, the first is the link to Spain. The idea that Columbus himself was of Jewish or converso origin is also introduced at this time by, once again, Spanish intellectuals. Spanish intellectuals and Jewish leaders seize upon that idea as a useful claim to help them secure their position on the white side of the color line. Oscar Strauss, who was a very important Jewish leader in the United States at this time, he was not Sephardic, he was Ashkenazi, but he thought and believed that if all Americans understood that Christopher Columbus was a Sephardic Jew, was a Jew, that this would be the way to resolve and end anti-Semitism in the United States, to demonstrate the contributions that Jews have made to American society would bring an end to Jew hatred, bring an end to the quotas at the universities that would be imposed, bring an end to immigration restriction that targeted Eastern and Southern Europeans, Jews particularly among them. This same idea would then be internalized and adopted and deployed by Sephardic Jews themselves. Most prominently, none other than Moise Gadol, the Zionist editor of La America, the Ladino newspaper. And he's the author of this pamphlet during World War I, 1941. Christopher Columbus was a Spanish Jew, he argues. And this is what he says. God placed the white race in Europe, the yellow race in Asia, the black race or Negroes in Africa, and the red race in America. But the New World is populated by all races and nationalities, the white race dominating. Notice the language, dominating, because the discoverer of the New World was of the white race from Europe. And he goes on to argue that what subset of the white race did Columbus pertain to that brought civilization to the barbaric lands of the Americas? I mean, you can see the colonial racist language is very, very clear here. Was a Sephardic Jew. So again, moving the position of the Sephardic Jew, come Oriental Jew or Ottoman Jew or Levantine Jew, rebranded as Spanish Jew, as Sephardic Jew, from the margins to the center, from outlier to the formulator, to the establisher, to the creator of white European settler colonial society in the Americas. Okay? This is the argument, and he goes on to detail. The forebears of the greatest men in the world, including Cristobal Colon, were Sephardic Jews. This is his argument. And he's making the argument for yet another reason. Okay? Refuge for Jews and humanity at large. Here you can see an image of Gadol. And he wrote it in English, by the way, because it was for the general American public he hoped would be exposed to this. Against the persecution, inquisition, and expulsion of the Jews from Spain, God created a Cristobal Colon of the same country, who aspired for the salvation of his defenseless brothers. From the worst anti-Semitic country in the world's history, he was inspired by God to risk his life and discover the New World for the benefit of humanity at large. He is responsible for over 300 million people enjoying freedom in this continent. So he makes a couple of different moves here. He's arguing that Columbus discovered America as a safe haven for persecuted Jews. Dubious. And the second piece is that it is to him that the Americans owe their freedoms on these shores, and by extension to the Sephardic Jews specifically and Jews in general. And he makes that argument very clear later in the text, where he says, all Jews, descendants of Cristobal Colon, should be respected by all other nationalities living in this great continent. In this new world, there is no room for anti-Semitism. The Jews must be treated with equality in commemoration of the discoverer Cristobal Colon, the Jew. Now it is to America to help the Jewish people to get their freedom, because Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus, discoverer of this continent, was a Marrano Jew from Spain. In other words, a Marrano is now it's considered exclusively derogatory term, relating probably to pig, but it was a term then used more colloquially to describe conversos, Jewish converts to Catholicism. Okay? Since all the nations of this continent owe their freedom to Columbus the Jew, it is their duty to pay tribute to the freedom of the great Jewish nation, the martyrs of Spain, Germany, Russia, etc. What's the argument that he's making here? The argument he is making is that Americans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans, those who think of themselves as the real Americans, or today some of the right-wing discourse uses the term heritage Americans, okay? It is an effort to ingratiate themselves with that dominant class and gain respect and entry into it. So it is not like, this is not the anti-imperialist league angle on the question. This is an embrace of empire, of European colonization, of European domination, putting a Jewish figure, a person of Jewish descent, as the key initiator of the entire European project in the Americas. Why is that argument being made in 1941? It is not only that Moise Gadol, the author who is a Zionist, wants recognition from other Jews and wants to be part and parcel of the broader project of Jewish nationalism and of Zionism, but he wants the United States to open its doors to the Jewish refugees of Europe, escaping, seeking to escape, needing to escape from persecution by the Nazis all across Europe at this time. Remember, immigration restriction is in effect. This is just 2 years after the infamous St. Louis ship incident, where about 900 refugees from Nazi Germany tried to arrive in the United States, tried to disembark, and they were rejected and turned back. Most of those people would be killed in the camps. Wasn't clear whether they were all going to be killed necessarily, but it was clear that the United States was not accepting Jewish refugees because of their ambiguous racial status, because of their different culture, because of the different language, because of the different heritage, because they were seen as a threat to the real, what were perceived at the time as the real Americans, the great racist thinkers of the day, like Madison Grant, for example, argued that letting in immigrants was committing race suicide. The great American people would be destroyed if Jews, if Greeks, if Armenians, even Italians were permitted to enter the country in large numbers. Forget Asians, who are excluded completely. Okay? So this is the framework that he is seeking to combat. And he is seeking to combat it on its own terms. In other words, he doesn't say the whole framework that imagines white people as superior to black people or Asian people or Middle Eastern people. He doesn't refute that hierarchy. What he wants to do is to expand the purview of whiteness, to expand the purview of Europeanness, to expand the purview of who is included in the community of the civilized, of the community of the real Americans. And he wants to demonstrate that Sephardic Jews too, and Jews in general, are part of that dominant community, that they deserve respect. They deserve dignity. They deserve equality. The implication, of course, well, not everybody's going to get that dignity and that equality, but at least it will be given to us in this unequal and unjust society, which, as you could imagine, other ideological strains among the Sephardic Jews, most notably the left-wing ones, were very critical of American exceptionalism, very critical of American empire, very critical of class and racial exploitation. So Sephardic Jews, it turns out, in the end, are a variegated community, both historically and today, with a wide range of ideological orientations and dispositions, and they were in the process of contesting the different ways in which they were seeking to navigate their newfound position in American society. One of those strategies, as it was also for the Italians, was to claim Columbus as their own. That Columbus, as the mascot of the people, would also be a shield. It would also be a sign and a ticket of entry into the dominant white community in the United States. And as I mentioned, it was not only Italians and not only Jews, and specifically Sephardic Jews, that were claiming Columbus as their own. Here we have a book, pardon me, from the 30s, Christopher Columbus, a Greek nobleman. And this argues, fascinatingly, that Columbus, the only way to explain Columbus's genius was that he must have been a Byzantine prince. Otherwise, there's no way to explain how someone could have created the discoveries necessary in terms of navigation and sailing to come all the way across the Atlantic and encounter a completely new geography. And the argument there is parallel to the Italian argument, parallel to the Jewish and the Sephardic Jewish argument. The Greek argument, as he says, the facts seem to indicate that, contrary to the general opinion that the Greeks are among the so-called new immigrants in America, in other words, they were also targeted by immigration restriction, they have been here since Columbus's day. In other words, they should be counted with the British and the Germans and the Swedish. This might, of course, be expected from a race par excellence of mariners, adventurers, and colonizers since the time of Ulysses to the present day. Particularly was this natural for these adventurous people after the conquest of their country by the Turks, when they were scattered to all four corners of the globe. And so he goes on to argue that the fall of Constantinople in 1453 produced an outmigration of the great thinkers and leaders of the Byzantine Empire, a scion of whom was none other than Columbus himself. Okay, Greeks had, within one generation, within just a couple of decades, had themselves been targeted not only by vicious Orientalist language that accused them also of being uncivilized, of barbarian, of Turks, of having harems, of being baptized in yogurt, and all this kind of stuff by white Christian Americans all across the country, but especially in the field of labor. Many Greeks were involved in the mining industry, and one of the largest mining strikes and anti-mining violence episodes that transpired in American history, a very infamous episode in labor history, was the Ludlow massacre following a strike in some of the mines in Colorado that led to an entire encampment of Greek workers being burned down and many massacred by the National Guard at this time. It was a very tragic moment, but it gave for the Greek American community the sense of tremendous anxiety that their position in American society is anything but secure. The hope was that claiming Columbus would elevate their status, would give them a new brand in American society, and give them the protection that they so desired. All of which revealed precisely the inequality of American society at that time. And I think that's one of the great lessons that we can learn from the claims about Columbus, is these claims were made by a variety of others, by a variety of peoples who were on the margins, who were on the cusp of being inside, outside, and claiming Columbus became a move to try to claim membership in the dominant system, in the dominant society, rather than, although there were efforts to undermine it, rather than undermine it, to reinforce it by expanding the purview of who is in the privileged class and ensuring that whether you're Italians, whether you're Jews or specifically Sephardic Jews, or whether you're Greeks, that you are inside of that class. This is the meaning of claiming Columbus in American history during the first half of the 20th century. Thank you for your attention.